Welcome to this edition of Hongos de Puerto Rico. Today we're going to be talking about the edible mushrooms of the island nation of Puerto Rico. To start off, we're going to talk about the flamingo chanterelle. This was a chanterelle that was recently described. So it's relatively new to science, but it is fairly common in all the coasts of Puerto Rico. Chanterelles, as many people might know, are a very well-known edible taxon of mushrooms. They're mycorrhizal, which means that they have an obligate symbiosis with a variety of plants. In the case of Puerto Rico, the chanterelles that grow on the coast, you will actually find them in a very strange habitat, which is the beach, because they're mycorrhizal with sea grape trees and bushes. Sea grape is a coastal plant that has kind of grape-sized fruits and large oval-shaped leaves. They form symbiosis with actually a variety of edible mushrooms, a couple more on this PowerPoint that I'll be talking about later. Cantharellus cibarius is probably the most well-known chanterelle. It's also known as the golden chanterelle, and it will grow with chanterelles in that complex will either grow with pines or oaks and other trees in that family, or in that order of tree. And the difference is that we have a very, our chanterelle has this very pink, kind of orangey pink color, which is where it gets its name, the flamingo chanterelle. And it's probably one of the ones that I've personally eaten the most. You can find lots of recipes for chanterelles online. Just follow any recipe for any variety or species of chanterelle. Chanterelle, the trick or the challenge for this chanterelle is because it's found on the beach, it can get quite sandy. So you have to clean the sand off of the fruiting body or off of the mushroom. Sometimes you can find them a little bit further inland where they're not quite as sandy, but they usually have to be soaked or washed and scrubbed quite well to make sure you don't get any sand in your on your mushroom. The next one is the wood ear. The wood ear, for me, is probably the best edible mushroom that can be found in Puerto Rico. And I'm going to tell you why I would say it's the best. Not because it's the best tasting, because really the wood ear doesn't have much of a taste at all. The wood ear mushroom is more consumed for its texture. It adds a really, really nice crunch to any dish that you add it to. It's usually added to soups or stews, but here in this slide you can see it can be the main ingredient in things like this is kind of like almost like a seaweed salad, but made out of the wood ear mushroom. But I would say it's the best mushroom because it can be stored very well in our tropical climate. You just have to dehydrate it, and it dehydrates very fast. Even if you leave it on the counter, by the end of the day, most of the water will have evaporated. But it's probably recommended that you dehydrate it in a more traditional sense, like either in a food dehydrator or dehydrated in the sun. Or one way that I always dehydrate my mushrooms, not necessarily edible mushrooms, but mushrooms I'm studying, is that I'll put it on the dash of my car, and that will make them really nice and dry. and they can be stored after they are dried. They can be stored in a jar or any sort of food container for a long time, probably a year, as long as they don't have any humidity. They can be stored for a long time, and then they're really easy to rehydrate. They just come right back to their fresh kind of. It's a type of jelly mushroom, so it'll kind of all of the cells will rehydrate and come back to its gelatinous texture. The next one I'm going to be talking about is another jelly mushroom, and this one, again, these are not really tasty mushrooms, but they are used for their textures. They add a really nice texture in certain dishes. Like this one is used in hot and sour soup, but it can also be used in even desserts like candied, and is known as the snow fungus or Tremella fusiformis. And this one actually has kind of a more what you would expect gelatinous texture compared to the woodier mushroom, which has, like I said, it has that crunch. This one is more of a soft kind of gelatinous texture. And it is a mushroom parasite, so it grows on wood, and it actually parasitizes another mushroom that is growing. So this other mushroom is always present on the wood that the snow fungus is growing on, and it's called Annulohypoxylon. It's an ascomycete, whereas this is a basidiomycete. And then in this slide, you can see how it is dried. It is cultivated and dried and sold at markets. This is a market in San Francisco, but traditionally this one and the woodier are used a lot in Asian cuisine. And the next one we're going to talk about is a very interesting example of a mushroom, an edible mushroom we know of because it is eaten in the neighboring island of Hispaniola in the country of Haiti. It is known as John John there, which is Creole for, it's basically just Creole for mushroom. But it is a mushroom that they eat in a dish called rice John John, which is mushroom with rice. And because it is it's in the brittle gills family, and these mushrooms have kind of jet black or very dark spores, and some of them even deliquesce, which means that they kind of, the caps will turn into this kind of black gooey liquid. You probably want to gather them before that happens, but this mushroom will turn whatever you're cooking it, whatever dish you're putting it into, it'll turn that dish, it'll dye it kind of a dark black color. So in this case, the rice, which is usually, a pale color, will turn into this this nice dark color. So another name for this dish is called black rice, I believe. And it is usually collected during the rainy season and dried and stored in households, whether stored in a bag or in somewhere in the kitchen, and it'll be used throughout the year to just add it, and it will add some nutrients and protein to whatever dish you use it in. Okay, so the next one is the wild shiitake. The wild shiitake is a mushroom that grows in the forests of Puerto Rico. It will grow from usually fallen branches or logs on the forest floor. And you'll see this is a pretty good edible mushroom, even though it's not super common because it is restricted to forests that are fairly healthy, and you don't find it in such a variety of habitats that you might find the wood ear mushroom, for example. But you can find pretty amazing fruitings of this mushroom where you'll see hundreds of this mushroom on a log. And they are quite small, at least a lot smaller than the commercial shiitake, which is the Lentinula edodes. And but they're quite similar looking in the sense that they have veil remnants kind of in a circle pattern on the top of the pileus. And the taste, it's another mushroom I've eaten, and the taste is very similar to the commercial shiitake once they're stir fried and put into a dish. Okay, so next we have the lion's mane mushroom. We don't actually have the commercial lion's mane, which is the species Hericium erinaceum, but we have a species that is close, if not the same, as Hericium coralloides. It is not it's not like a ball of spines like the commercial lion's mane, but it's more got these little branches of spines. But the taste is the same as a commercial lion's mane would taste. And so it's very well known for, it has for its medicinal properties. It's supposed to help with neurogenesis as well. But our native species hasn't really been studied very well. But it is a really, really, really tasty mushroom. Probably the best tasting of the ones I have on here because it has this really delicate seafood flavor, like kind of like crab meat or something like that. So the only thing is it's pretty rare. I've only found it a couple times, and I don't see a lot of other people around Puerto Rico finding it, or at least taking photos of it and posting it to the Facebook group. And I included this look-alike mushroom, which is Herpex rosetiformis. It used to be known as let's see, Hydnopolyporus, but the name just changed on this one. But it is also an edible mushroom. It just doesn't have a nice delicate texture like the Hericium does. It's kind of actually got a very tough texture, but it is eaten by indigenous people in the Amazon. So it's not a dangerous lookalike. It's just not as, I would say it's not as tasty as the lion's mane. Next, we have the chicken of the woods. This is a very popular mushroom in the United States, where it's probably found more commonly. In Puerto Rico, it's quite rare. I only find it in the state forests. And I almost, at least the ones I've found, I've almost found all of them. I've found them on introduced eucalyptus trees, which were introduced into the forest for wood milling purposes for the timber industry, which that industry is no longer around in Puerto Rico. So these trees have been left in the forests, and they've actually grown quite large. And I believe the species that you find on these introduced eucalyptus trees is Latiporus gilbertsonii, which is also found in the southeast United States. And I haven't personally tried eating them either because I've heard mixed things about eating chicken of the woods that grows from eucalyptus, and I'm not sure if there's any truth to. Some people do get GI, gastrointestinal distress from eating chicken of the woods, and that can vary from person to person. So it's always recommended, at least with chicken of the woods, to try a small piece before eating a huge meal. But we also have in Puerto Rico a native species. Not saying that Latoporus gilbertsonia is not native, but I'm not sure if it could have been introduced with the tree, with the eucalyptus. We have a species called Latoporus carabensis that was described here by the Forest Service mycologist Gene Lodge a number of years ago. And so that one, for me, it is more rare. I'm not sure if I've actually found that species here, but it's another potential edible mushroom. Next, we have the puffball. Now this, the difference is that this is a very urban mushroom, whereas the last couple that I've been showing are only found in forests or pretty healthy forests. This is a mushroom that I would say it's another one of the best edibles in the sense that it is very common to find it, and to find it in yards or places where there's a lot of, that's frequented by a lot of people. And there is a little bit of, you do have to be cautious. You want to make sure that the yards, they haven't been spraying a lot of chemicals, because that could be either on, or sometimes certain heavy metals can be metabolized by the mushrooms. So you have to make sure that the area you're collecting these is not too contaminated. But that being said, if you're just finding these in your yard and you're practicing pretty organic gardening practices, it's a very good edible mushroom. It really can be used in anywhere that you use tofu in a recipe. The texture is very, very similar to tofu, kind of spongy, not a lot of mushroom flavor, but it would take on the flavor of anything you cook it with. It'll absorb a lot of liquid or whatever you're cooking it with. And they can grow quite big, probably bigger than a softball. And the only thing is, you don't always find them in perfect condition. You want them to be very, very young and firm. When they start to get soft, even when they're white inside, the texture is not as agreeable. And then eventually the spores will mature. The spores, unlike most mushrooms, they mature on the inside. It's known as a gastroid fungus. Which means the spores develop on the inside, and they kind of turn into this purple powdery mass. And so when somebody steps on it, or through the mechanics of rain, those spores will be released eventually from the dry mushroom and spread to a new place. And another thing I like to do is, when I do find these sporulating puffballs or calvadia, I like to take those and just throw them in my yard, and in the hopes that a new colony will start to grow in the yard. And it has actually worked for us before. Okay, so next I have the almond mushroom. It's a species of Agaricus. Agaricus is notoriously difficult to ID or identify to species level. And in the tropics, we have a ton of species diversity of Agaricus. But this one is fairly easy to identify. One, because it has a really unique texture to the veil. And in this photo, unfortunately, you can't see the veil texture. But if you're going to be collecting Agaricus, you need to do a little bit more research in order to positively identify it. So I recommend looking at more images of Agaricus subrufescens. But their stature is pretty unique. They're pretty large Agaricus for the tropics. They have this kind of brown these brown scales on the pileus, and the other giveaway is the very strong almond smell when they're fresh. A lot of Agaricus give off almond smell, but this is one of those that smells very strong of almond, and it is comparable to the portobello mushroom, which is probably the most common mushroom. If anybody's ever eaten a mushroom, they've eaten Agaricus bisporus, which is the mushroom you buy at the supermarket, whether it's the white mushroom or the larger brown portobello mushroom. They're actually the same species of mushroom, just harvested at a different time. So any sort of recipe you use portobello in, you can use Agaricus subrufescens. They grow in organic material like mulched gardens or even composted, compost piles all over the island, whether it's coastal or higher elevations. Okay, so this mushroom is extremely rare to find in Puerto Rico, but I just wanted to highlight it because it's, one, got a very interesting look, and two, is highly coveted for its use as kind of a vegan meat substitute, because it really looks, when you cut it in the middle, it looks just like a cut of beef, which is why it's called the beefsteak fungus. And it's a species of Fistulina. I'm not sure, it hasn't really been studied very well in Puerto Rico, but the only place, it's only been found a couple times, and in the higher elevation primary forests. So it's not something you could find in an urban setting or in secondary forest necessarily. It's fairly rare, and I found it growing with a pretty rare tree that has declining numbers called tabonuco, that grows in Puerto Rico. And so I just wanted to show as an example, it's collected a lot in the United States. Fistulina hepatica is collected in the United States. I'm not sure if the species we have in Puerto Rico is the same as the one that grows in the United States, but here's an example of some cuts of the mushroom, which look like maybe beef cuts, and then it can be fried and eaten. Probably any recipe you would use those cuts of meat. Next, this one is another really interesting one because of its size, so its potential to feed a lot of people, especially when you're finding these really, really big individuals. I don't have really great photos of this mushroom, so I'm sharing some photos that users have uploaded to the Fungi of Puerto Rico Facebook group. And I put their names underneath the photos. But this first one in the upper left is very interesting because you can see there's some small children standing by it, and they're just a little bit taller than the mushroom itself. So this mushroom is probably a couple feet tall. And then to the right of that, there's also another really, really quite large example. And these are kind of maybe outliers. Maybe you won't find them growing that big, generally speaking, but they grow quite big. This one, I've found them a couple times, and they're usually, maybe at the smallest, the size of a beer can or a beer bottle or something like that. And you can cut them up and use them just like you would use the portobello, just like you would use agaricus, the almond agaricus mushroom. I prepared one once, and so to preserve it, I stir fried it, and I had pieces of that mushroom in the freezer for almost a year because it was so much food because the mushroom itself is so big. They grow in kind of disturbed areas, so it's one you could find in your garden, or even I found them in my urban neighborhood right next to the sidewalk. It seems that they like areas where there's maybe been a tree trunk. I've seen them growing from, it looks like, the base of an old palm trunk that was cut down maybe years prior. So they like a lot of organic material, but it's something you could find in San Juan, in the city, and also in more, in gardens or farms as well. And it's hard to mistake, just based on its size. And it has the potential to provide a lot of food for whoever finds it. Next is another mushroom that can actually grow, in urban areas and can grow very, very large. It's the genus Phlebopus. Phlebopus is a genus of saprobic bolete. So think your king boletes, stuff like, so boletes in general are mushrooms that they have pores on the bottom instead of gills. And probably 98% of them are mycorrhizal, which means they have symbiosis. They form symbiosis with trees. And the interesting thing about the genus Phlebopus is that it doesn't need to form symbiosis with plants. It grows, I have a picture here from a user who found it in a growing from a gravel landscaped area in urban San Juan. And there have been some successful attempts at cultivating it in just soil inside of planters without any plants involved. And so it's been successfully fruited in those conditions. There are some closely related mushrooms that, instead of forming mycorrhizae with plants, they actually form kind of like these sclerotia, which are these little kind of hollow balls made out of mycelium or hyphae, and they kind of attract insects, whether they're aphids or another type of insect, and they kind of provide a little safe home for that insect in exchange for honeydew, which is kind of like a metabolite that the insects exchange with them in exchange for having a safe place to live inside the mushroom hyphae. So I'm not sure if that is what's happening with Phlebopus, but whatever they're doing, they're pretty successful, and they can actually grow really, really quite large fruiting bodies. And it's one that I haven't personally eaten, but they're not super common, but they can be found. They can be found pretty frequently in different habitats across Puerto Rico, and there's quite a bit of documentation that different Phlebopus species are eaten, at least in Asia and different parts of the world. Okay, so next, this one should be the most familiar, or one of the most familiar to everybody who's eaten mushrooms before, the oyster mushroom. The oyster mushroom is usually the first mushroom that anybody who's ever cultivated mushroom or grown mushrooms at home will try, because it is the most forgiving. It grows on the widest variety of substrates, and it can resist contamination really well. So in Puerto Rico, we have a couple species of oyster mushroom, but by far the most common one that you're going to find, like over 90% of the time, is Pleurotus jamor, which is the pink oyster mushroom, or that is what it's known as in its cultivated form. But the curious thing about the pink oyster mushroom that we have in Puerto Rico is that in the wild, it actually is not pink. It's almost always very pale white colored. And there are a few lookalikes of the oyster mushroom in Puerto Rico. Oyster mushrooms are common. You can find them. I find they grow from palm tree a lot, especially in the coast, but they'll also grow from angiosperm trees all over the island, and they'll grow in the rainforest. They'll grow in fairly dry forests during the rainy season. And so the lookalikes are also edible. The thing is, they're very they're not as appetizing as the oyster mushroom. So I wanted to include this lookalike because it's very common in Puerto Rico. It's called Lentinus sclerapus, and it's almost without fail confused with Pleurotus, with the oyster mushroom. So here's an example of Lentinus sclerapus. It's quite a bit bigger. It grows, the diameter of the mushroom is quite a bit bigger than the oyster mushroom. And it's a lot tougher because it has an extra type of hyphae called skeletal binding hyphae. And if you actually remove it from the tree, you'll see that it has a stem, a very short stem, but it has a stem. And you'll see these little black glandular dots on the stem. And that tells you that you're looking at a lentinus and not an oyster mushroom. Oyster mushrooms have virtually no stem at all. So that's one way you can tell the difference. And there's a wide variety of lentinus. There's also an introduced lentinus called Lentinus sajar-kaju that's actually from the old world countries and continents like Asia and Africa. So that's another species that's very often confused with Pleurotus jamor. And another one I wanted to mention is Fabulus brasiliensis. That's another one that instead of gills underneath it has kind of this honeycomb pattern. It's another one that you could eat, but very often confused with oyster mushroom. Okay, so this one is, some of these I haven't actually eaten myself, but I'm including them because there is quite good evidence that they're edible mushrooms. So this one is it has been called Polyporus talpi or Polyporus brettonii. And what it is in fact, Polyporus is kind of a waste bin taxon, in the sense that it's not actually a species of the genus Polyporus. And so we have good evidence that this one that is found in Puerto Rico is actually a species of Kusagiporia, which is a genus that was very recently described from Africa. And it's also been sequenced from Brazil, so it seems to be a pan-tropical genus, and it forms these huge fruiting bodies, which are oftentimes mistaken for Latiporus persicines, which is the white. I've seen that referred to as the white chicken mushroom, or white chicken of the woods mushroom. But this one grows much, much larger. It can be over 3 feet, or at least the ones I've measured in Puerto Rico. And so it's actually closely related to the chicken of the woods mushroom. There was a new, so Latiporus is chicken of the woods. There was a new family erected called Latiporacea. And so this Kusagiporia is in the family Latiporaceae, which is the family of the chicken of the woods mushrooms. So in Tanzania, it's actually collected for food. As far as I know, I haven't heard reports that in South America it's collected as food, even though this genus is present in South America. And well, one of the challenges of Puerto Rico is that there's really no mushroom gathering culture. So just recently, I mean, just based on social media and kind of the gaining popularity of mushrooms in general, people have started collecting some mushrooms in Puerto Rico, such as the chanterelle, oyster mushrooms, things like that. But I could not find any documentation that this mushroom was ever eaten by indigenous people of Puerto Rico or otherwise. As far as I know, there's no documentation that indigenous people ate mushrooms in Puerto Rico, which I'm sure they did. It's just it's not well documented, or at least I haven't heard of it. But because of their large size, this is a very this mushroom has a great potential for feeding a lot of people. It's just we need to kind of explore that area a little bit more. Now this one is a more familiar edible mushroom that's fairly common in Puerto Rico. It's called the paddy straw mushroom. It's grown traditionally. It's grown in countries in Asia, but it's also grown in the United States and different countries throughout the world, because it can be grown in a very low tech with very low tech techniques. Really, you can even use the same, instead of having inoculant, you can use the same mushroom fruiting bodies, and you can find different techniques on how to cultivate it in a low-tech way at home. But generally, straw is used as a substrate, although you can use banana leaves, which is just something where here, when you find the wild paddy straw mushroom, which is Volvariella volvacea, or Volvacea, you find it on fallen stems of banana plants and plantains. But this one in the photo, I actually found it growing from charcoal remnants of barbecue kiosk in the coastal area of Puerto Rico. So obviously it has different, it can use a variety of substrates to grow, but very common, growing with banana dead banana stems. And then another one that's one of the most beautiful mushrooms that I've ever seen is Volvariella bombacina, which is instead of, unlike the paddy straw mushroom, the Volvariella volvacea, this one grows with usually from more substrates with more lignin, like tree trunks or dead trees. I'm not sure if I've ever seen it growing from a live tree, but definitely it grows from dead tree branches. And it's just got such a beautiful, vibrant yellow cap. And it's also an edible mushroom. So these are usually gathered. They have what's called the vulva, which is part of the universal veil, much like an amanita, and it's usually recommended not to, to make sure that you don't confuse your paddy straw mushrooms with a deadly amanita, which also grow from these universal veils. But in Puerto Rico, we actually don't have a large variety of amanita. We don't have any documented deadly amanita species because we don't have conifer forests that they um, these are these amanita mushrooms are mycorrhizal with conifers, um, and we don't have native conifer forests. And the conifer forests we have uh, don't have the variety of um, of mushrooms that you would find in a native conifer forest. So next we have this one that I wanted to include because I found this very interesting botanical work about people, and as part of their indigenous culture in Chiapas Basin of Mexico, they recognize and gather this mushroom, and they make these really, really delicious looking, um, I guess, what are they, uh, enchiladas or tamales or something. Um, and so they use this mushroom for as the filling for this dish, and it's quite common in Puerto Rico on the coast. It is much like the chanterelle, which was the first slide. They are symbiotic with sea grape trees. So anywhere where you find sea grape, whether it's Cocoloba uvifera or Cocoloba diversifolia, you'll often find these mushrooms. They kind of just look like a gelatinous blob, but if you cut them in the middle, they have these beautiful growth zones, almost like a tree trunk. And they're very spongy. And apparently, for the people of this area of Mexico, you know, they're a good source of food. But as far as I know, in Puerto Rico, they're not consumed. And then last, I just wanted to show a recent discovery um, of a new species of truffle, which is also a mycorrhizal, uh, taxon, and the one that we have here in Puerto Rico, it grows with sea grape, just like the last mushroom I showed, and just like the chanterelle, it's mycorrhizal with sea grape, and so it's a true species of tuber, which is true truffles, and the truffle is one of the most expensive foods in the world. This is one of the kind of prized species from Italy, known as the Italian summer truffle, Tuber estivum. And the one we have here has not been described yet. So, um, so right now I'm kind of working to see if we can put a name to this species that grows with sea grape. It doesn't really grow that deep. Um, it's pretty superficial on the surface of the soil, but underneath the leaf litter of sea grape trees and coastal forests. I found it just by accident when I was photographing some other mycorrhizal or symbiotic mushrooms that grow with the sea grape. I just noticed that these little, there were these little balls at the base, and when I cut them open, I saw this pattern, which is kind of a marbling that's very indicative of truffles. And then, of course, I looked at the spores, and the spores are truffle spores, which are very, they have a certain type of reticulation. They're very large spores. And then this one has actually also been sequenced. So it's in that group, that true truffle genus. But it's something that's very interesting, very unique to find in the tropics. Truffles, even a few years ago, they were thought that they only grew in temperate countries, but this one grows just right on the coast of Puerto Rico. So it's got a very distinct smell to it. Like for me, it was like smelling a bag of barbecue Lay's potato chips or something like that. But all truffles have a certain garlic odor, or kind of like a mix of garlic and gaseous odors. And this definitely has those notes to it. So that concludes the presentation in English of the edible fungi of Puerto Rico. Thanks for listening.